The air over Puget Sound was still that evening. August 10th, 2018. A Friday night in Seattle, where the summer sun lingered long past what seemed reasonable, casting everything in that golden, tired light that makes the world feel both infinite and temporary at once. The Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Sea-Tac as everyone calls it, hummed with its usual symphony of engines and announcements, gate changes and boarding calls, the endless shuffle of humanity moving through its concourses like blood through arteries. But down on the tarmac, away from the crowds and the carry-ons and the complaints about delayed connections, there existed another world entirely. A world of baggage handlers and fuel truck drivers, ramp agents and maintenance crews. The invisible people who make flight possible, but whom passengers never see, never think about, never thank. Richard Russell was one of them. 29 years old, married, a ground service agent for Horizon Air, working the evening shift like he'd done countless times before. His job was simple, repetitive, the kind of work that becomes muscle memory after enough repetitions. Load the bags, guide the planes, move the equipment, do it again. He was good at it, by all accounts, reliable, pleasant, the kind of employee who showed up on time, did what was asked, smiled when appropriate. Nobody would have picked him out of a lineup as someone to watch. Nobody would have guessed that on this particular Friday evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the Olympic Mountains, Richard Russell was about to do something that would gen the aviation world, captivate millions, and leave behind more questions than answers. The Bombardier Q400 sat on cargo ramp C, a turboprop regional airliner, 76 seats, registration number N449QX, painted in Alaska Airlines livery with the distinctive face of a Native American elder on its tail. It was empty that night, parked, undergoing some routine maintenance, not scheduled for any flights, just another plane in a sea of planes, another piece of equipment in an airport that handled over 500 aircraft movements every day. At approximately 7:32 p.m. Pacific time, security cameras that would later be scrutinized frame by frame, dissected by investigators and internet sleuths alike, captured Richard Russell climbing into the cockpit of that Q400. He was alone. He was unauthorized. And he was about to start the engines. What goes through a person's mind in those moments? What internal calculation happens when someone crosses the line from thinking about something to actually doing it? These are the questions that haunt the aftermath, the questions that friends and family and investigators turn over endlessly, like stones in their hands, looking for answers in the weight and texture of them. But in that moment, Richard Russell was not thinking about the aftermath. He was thinking about the sky. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. Then the propellers began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, building to that distinctive thrumming roar that marks a turboprop coming online. On the ground, other workers noticed. A plane starting up on cargo C wasn't unusual in itself, but there was something about the timing, the context, that made a few people pause and look. But airports are busy places, and everyone had their own tasks to focus on. and by the time anyone thought to question what they were seeing, the Q400 was already moving. Richard Russell had never flown a plane before. Not for real. He'd logged hours on flight simulators, the kind you can buy for your home computer, programs that let you sit in your bedroom and pretend you're at the controls of everything from a Cessna to a 747. He'd watched YouTube videos, instructional guides, cockpit tours. He'd absorbed the language of aviation the way some people absorb baseball statistics or movie trivia, storing away information about thrust vectoring and approach angles and the specific sequence of switches you need to flip to bring a turboprop to life. But watching videos and moving digital throttles is not the same as feeling the actual weight of a 76-seat aircraft responding to your hands, the way the controls fight back, the way everything is heavier and louder and more real than any simulation could ever prepare you for. And yet, somehow, he was doing it. The Q400 rolled forward, away from its parking spot, navigating the complex maze of taxiways that crisscross Sea-Tac like veins. At 7:41 p.m., the first radio transmission crackled to life. Air traffic control at Sea-Tac, monitoring their screens, tracking the dozens of aircraft in their airspace, saw something that didn't make sense. A Horizon Q400, call sign unknown, moving without clearance, without a flight plan, without any communication. The controller's voice, when it came over the frequency, carried the professional calm that training demands. But underneath it, there was already a note of confusion, an edge of something not quite right. Horizon guy. Ground. They're looking for you. Richard Russell's voice, when he responded, was nothing like what anyone expected. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't angry. It wasn't the voice of a hijacker or a terrorist or someone in the grip of rage. It was casual, almost cheerful, with a slight tremor that might have been nerves or excitement or both. He sounded, in that first transmission, like someone calling into a radio show, like someone who was simultaneously aware of the enormity of what he was doing and somehow detached from it, watching himself from a distance. Yeah, this is, Horizon, Horizon ground. This is, Rich. I'm trying to just do a couple things. I want to do a couple maneuvers, just kind of, see what she can do before I put her down. You know what I mean? The controllers looked at each other. In the tower, in the radar rooms, in the security offices that were just beginning to understand what was happening, there was a moment of collective disbelief. This wasn't following any script they knew. Hijackings have a protocol. Bomb threats have a protocol. Medical emergencies, mechanical failures, even complete radio failures, they all have protocols. But a ground service agent stealing an empty commercial aircraft to see what she can do before putting her down. There was no protocol for that. The Q400 accelerated down the taxiway, and Richard Russell, who had never flown a real plane, who had never received a single hour of formal flight training, who was not a pilot and had never claimed to be, somehow managed to align the aircraft with runway 16C. The longest runway at Sea-Tac 9,426 feet of concrete stretching out into the fading light. The controllers were still talking, still trying to establish what was happening, who this person was, what his intentions were. But Richard Russell was done talking for the moment. He pushed the throttles forward. The sound of a turboprop at full power is not the smooth jet engine roar that most people associate with aircraft. It's rougher, more mechanical, a kind of aggressive churning that vibrates through the entire airframe. The Q400 surged forward, picking up speed, the runway lights blurring past the cockpit windows. 50 knots, 70, 90. The aircraft rattled and shook, the nose wheel still firmly planted on the concrete. And then, at approximately 7:50 p.m., Richard Russell pulled back on the yoke, and for the first time in his life, he felt the earth fall away beneath him. The Q400 lifted into the summer sky. It climbed, initially shallow, then steeper as he found the rhythm of it, the feel of the controls. Below him, Sea-Tac erupted into organized chaos. Emergency protocols activated. Security scrambled. Law enforcement agencies were notified up and down the chain of command. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, received an alert about an unauthorized aircraft departure from Seattle. At Joint Base Lewis McChord, approximately 15 miles south of Sea-Tac, F-15 fighter jets were being prepped for scramble. But up in the air, climbing over Puget Sound, with the Olympic Mountains rising purple and massive to the west, and the city of Seattle glittering to the north, Richard Russell was experiencing something that most people will never experience. He was alone in the sky, completely, utterly alone, in a way that perhaps he had never been alone in his entire life. The radio conversations that followed, which would later be released to the public and dissected word by word, pause by pause, inflection by inflection, have an almost surreal quality to them. On one end, you have the air traffic controllers, trained professionals doing their best to manage an unprecedented situation, trying to establish rapport, trying to guide this unauthorized aircraft to a safe landing, trying to prevent what everyone in that tower knew could very easily become a catastrophic tragedy. On the other end, you have Richard Russell, who spoke with a kind of all-shucks humility that seemed completely at odds with the fact that he'd just stolen a commercial aircraft and was currently performing maneuvers over one of the most densely populated regions in the Pacific Northwest. "You know," he said at one point, his voice crackling through the radio with that same casual tone, "I wasn't really planning on landing it. I was kinda hoping that was gonna be it, you know?" The controller, a man whose name we don't know, but whose professionalism in that moment deserves recognition, responded with careful neutrality. "Well, Rich, if you could just maybe, try to land that airplane safely and not hurt anybody on the ground, that's what we're all trying to do here, okay?" "Yeah," Rich replied, and there was a pause, the kind of pause that feels weighted with thought. "All right, yeah, I don't want to hurt nobody. I just want you to whisper sweet nothings into my ear." It was a strange thing to say, oddly intimate and vulnerable, and somehow completely sincere, despite the absurdity of the context. And it revealed something essential about Richard Russell in those final moments, something that would become central to how the public came to understand and remember him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to make a political statement or send a message or hurt anyone. He was, in some fundamental way, just talking, just being honest in a way that perhaps he hadn't been able to be honest before. The Q400 banked over the water, and Rich's voice came back on the radio, now filled with genuine wonder. "Hey, you think if I land this successfully, Alaska will give me a job as a pilot?" The controller, maintaining that careful, steady tone, replied, "You know, I think they would give you a job doing anything if you could pull this off." "Yeah, right." Rich laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind of laugh you hear at a bar or in a break room, not in the cockpit of a stolen aircraft. "Nah, I'm a white guy. Minimum wage. I've been to a couple of those places you just mentioned, and they're gorgeous. I mean this, the sights went by so fast. I was thinking, I'm going to try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, then I'm just gonna nose down and call it a night." A barrel roll. It's an aerobatic maneuver that requires precise timing and control, the kind of thing that stunt pilots practice for years to perfect. The Q400 is not designed for aerobatics. It's a regional passenger aircraft built for efficiency and reliability, not for rolling inverted at altitude. The stress such a maneuver would place on the airframe could very easily result in structural failure, a catastrophic breakup in mid-air. The controllers knew this. The aviation experts who were beginning to monitor the situation knew this. Richard Russell, with his flight simulator experience and his YouTube education, almost certainly knew this too. And he was going to try it anyway. But before that, there was more talking. More conversation that oscillated between the mundane and the profound, between dark humor and genuine emotion. Rich talked about how he wasn't a pilot, but had played some video games before. He talked about how beautiful everything looked from up there, how he could see Mount Rainier in the distance, snow-capped and massive, presiding over the landscape like some ancient god. He apologized to the controllers for making them deal with this situation. He apologized to his friends and family, though they couldn't hear him yet, wouldn't hear him until later when the recordings were released and the world learned what had happened. "Hey," he said at one point, "do you think if I tried to land this thing on the water, I won't hurt anyone that way?" The controller, still trying, still doing everything in his power to find a way out of this that didn't end in death, replied, "I don't know, man. I don't know. I wasn't really planning on that. But if you wanted to try, we could talk you through that." Rich considered this for a moment, the radio silent except for the background hum of the aircraft systems, the steady drone of the engines. Then he said, "Nah, I don't want to do that to you. I think I'm just going to try to do a barrel roll, and then, that'll probably be it." There's something both heartbreaking and darkly comedic about the way he phrased it. This idea that he was concerned about inconveniencing the air traffic controllers, about causing them trouble, even as he was literally flying a stolen aircraft in unauthorized airspace and contemplating aerobatic maneuvers that would almost certainly end in his death. It speaks to a kind of fundamental decency, a consideration for others that persisted even in the midst of what was clearly a psychological crisis. Richard Russell didn't want to hurt anyone. He said it multiple times, and by all accounts, he meant it. What he wanted was something else entirely, something harder to articulate, something that maybe even he couldn't fully explain. The Q400 continued its flight, tracing loops and turns over the Puget Sound, and on radar screens across the region, controllers and military personnel watched its path with growing concern. The aircraft was approaching populated areas. It was descending and climbing in ways that seemed erratic, unpredictable. The F-15S were now airborne, streaking north from Joint Base Lewis McChord at speeds that made the Q400's 170-knot cruise speed look like a crawl. Their orders were clear: maintain visual contact, track the aircraft, be prepared to take action if it became clear that Richard Russell intended to crash into a populated area or a critical infrastructure target. Because that was the fear, wasn't it? In a post-9/11 world, an unauthorized aircraft over a major metropolitan area triggers very specific protocols, very specific nightmares. But Richard Russell wasn't heading towards Seattle. He wasn't flying toward Tacoma or Bellevue or any of the cities that dotted the shoreline. He was heading south and west, out over the water, toward the sparsely populated islands that scatter across the southern end of Puget Sound. At 8:23 p.m., approximately 52 minutes after he first started the engines, the F-15S arrived. Two of them, dark shapes against the darkening sky, pulling alongside the Q400 at a distance, maintaining formation, their pilots in constant communication with command, with the controllers, with the entire apparatus of military and civilian aviation authority that was now focused on this one stolen aircraft and the 29-year-old ground service agent flying it. Rich noticed them almost immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice coming over the radio with what sounded like genuine surprise. "Those fighter jets are so cool. You know, I always wanted to be, like, in the military and be a pilot, but I wasn't cut out for it, I guess." The controller responded, still steady, still professional, still trying to establish some kind of connection that might lead to a different ending. "Well, you're flying right now. You're doing great." And in a way, that was true. Against all odds, against all logic and training and aeronautical engineering, Richard Russell was flying. He was keeping the aircraft aloft, maintaining altitude, executing turns, responding to the controls. It was sloppy, certainly. It was dangerous, absolutely. But it was flight. And from up there, 7,000 feet above the water, with the sun setting and the islands spreading out below like pieces of jade in a dark blue setting, with fighter jets on his wings and the whole world watching, Richard Russell was seeing something that most people never get to see. He was seeing the Earth from above, seeing the place where he'd lived and worked and existed as something small and beautiful and temporary. "I got a lot of people that care about me," he said, his voice softer now, more contemplative. "It's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this, I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. Just a broken guy. 3 words that would echo across social media and news broadcasts. 3 words that somehow captured something essential about the modern condition, about the quiet desperation that can exist beneath a pleasant exterior, about the way people can be falling apart inside while appearing completely functional on the outside. Richard Russell had a wife who loved him. He had friends. He had a job, a home, a life that from the outside looked normal, maybe even good. And yet, here he was, flying a stolen plane, talking about having screws loose, apologizing to everyone who cared about him for doing something that he knew would hurt them. The Q400 descended slightly, leveling off at around 5,000 feet, and Rich's breathing was audible over the radio now, heavier, faster. "I think I'm going to try to do a barrel roll now," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like excitement, like a kid about to jump off a high dive for the first time. "If I crash and die, just know that I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anybody." The controllers, the military commanders, the emergency responders who were now positioning themselves around the potential crash zones, they all held their breath. This was the moment. This was where the laws of physics and the limitations of the airframe and the complete lack of formal training would intersect, and the result would almost certainly be catastrophic. A Q400, breaking apart at altitude, debris raining down into the sound, a fireball visible for miles. That was the expected outcome. That was what everyone watching the radar screens was bracing for. Richard Russell rolled the Q400 inverted. The aircraft flipped, the world turning upside down, the water suddenly where the sky should be, and the sky where the water should be. And for a few seconds, that must have felt like hours. The Q400 hung there, inverted, defying gravity and probability and every rule in the aviation handbook. Then he brought it back around, completing the rotation, the aircraft shuddering and groaning under the stress, but somehow, impossibly, remaining intact. He'd done it. Richard Russell, with no formal training, with nothing but flight simulator hours and determination and perhaps a complete lack of self-preservation instinct, had just successfully executed a barrel roll in a commercial turboprop aircraft. "Holy smokes," he shouted into the radio, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "I did it. That was a barrel roll. Did you see that?" In the tower, in the command centers, in the cockpits of the F-15S flying Escort, there was a moment of stunned silence. He'd actually pulled it off. Against all odds, against all reason, he'd performed an aerobatic maneuver that should have killed him, and he'd survived it. The Q400 was still flying. He was still alive, and for just a moment there was hope, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, somehow, this could still end differently. But the fuel gauge was dropping. The Q400 had been flying for almost an hour now, burning through its reserves, and Rich was beginning to sound different on the radio. The initial excitement, the dark humor, the casual conversation, It was giving way to something else. Fatigue, perhaps, or clarity, or resignation. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "I don't want to. I was kind of hoping that was going to be it, you know?" The controller tried again, using Rich's own words, his own concerns. "Rich, if we could get you to land that aircraft safely, we'll make sure you're okay. We'll get you help. We'll make sure that you're safe." There was a long pause. The F-15S maintained their position, dark angels flanking the stolen turboprop as it descended gradually toward the islands below. The sun had fully set now, and the sky was that deep blue-purple color that exists in the moments before true darkness, and the lights of civilization twinkled across the water like scattered stars. "Nah," Rich finally said, and his voice was calm, certain, maybe even peaceful. "I think I'm going to land it, in a safe kind of manner. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want this to be over." The Q400 descended through the darkening sky, its silhouette growing smaller against the backdrop of gathering night. Below, Ketron Island rose from the waters of Puget Sound, a small, sparsely populated piece of land covered in dense forest, part of Pierce County, home to maybe a dozen full-time residents and a scattering of vacation homes. It wasn't a strategic target. It wasn't symbolic of anything. It was just a piece of land, relatively isolated, relatively empty, and Richard Russell was pointing his stolen aircraft directly toward it. The controllers were still talking, still trying, still holding on to that thread of connection they'd managed to establish over the past hour. "Rich, if you could try to find a safe place to land, we can get you the help you need," one of them said. And the professionalism was still there. But underneath it now, you could hear something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or the weight of knowing that they were running out of options, running out of time, running out of words that might make a difference. Rich's response came back lighter than expected, almost cheerful again in that mercurial way his mood had shifted throughout the flight. "I don't know, man. I don't need that much help. I've played video games before, so I know what I'm doing a little bit." Then, after a pause, his tone shifted, became more serious, more reflective. "Ah, man, those guys would rough me up if I tried to land there. I think I might mess something up there too. I wouldn't want to do that. They probably got anti-aircraft missiles and stuff." He was talking about McCord Field, the military base where the F-15S had scrambled from, and the controllers tried to redirect him, tried to offer alternatives. "Rich, there's no anti-aircraft at McCord Field. If you wanted to land, that's probably the best place to go." But Rich was already shaking his head, already dismissing the idea, and even though they couldn't see him, you could hear it in his voice, the way he'd made his decision and was committed to it with the kind of finality that leaves no room for negotiation. "Nah," he said. "I'm going to do a nose down and call it a night." Those words hung in the air, transmitted through radio waves, received by controllers and military personnel and emergency responders who had spent the last hour hoping, planning, trying to orchestrate any outcome other than the one that was now becoming inevitable. In the F-15S, the pilots watched through their targeting systems, through their helmets' heads-up displays, tracking the Q400 as it descended lower, aiming for the dark mass of Ketron Island like a moth drawn to flame. Their orders remained unchanged: observe, track, be prepared to engage only if the aircraft posed an imminent threat to populated areas. But Richard Russell wasn't flying toward cities or infrastructure. He was flying toward trees and emptiness, toward a place where his death would be contained, where the only casualty would be himself. At 8:46 p.m. Pacific Time, approximately 75 minutes after he first started the engines, the Q400 disappeared from radar. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft struck the heavily forested southwest end of Ketron Island at high speed, the nose driving into the earth and trees, the fuselage crumpling like aluminum foil, the fuel tanks rupturing and igniting in a fireball that lit up the darkening sky and could be seen from the mainland. The explosion echoed across the water, a deep, resonant boom that rattled windows and sent birds scattering from their roosts. Then silence. Just the sound of flames crackling through underbrush, the hiss and pop of burning aviation fuel, and the distant wail of sirens beginning to converge on the scene. Richard Russell was dead. There was never any doubt about that, never any possibility that someone could survive an impact of that magnitude, that violence. The Q400 was obliterated, scattered across a debris field that stretched through the forest. Pieces of aircraft and engine and cockpit instruments embedded in trees and buried in soil. First responders who arrived on the scene described it as a crater, a scar torn into the earth, still burning hours later despite their efforts to extinguish it. There was nothing left that resembled an aircraft, nothing left that resembled a person, just fragments and ash and the acrid smell of destruction. News of the crash spread quickly, the way news always does in the digital age, amplified and accelerated by social media and cable news and the insatiable appetite for tragedy that characterizes modern media consumption. Initial reports were confused, contradictory. Some outlets reported it as a possible terrorist attack, a hijacking, a security breach of catastrophic proportions. Others focused on the miraculous fact that only the perpetrator had died, that despite flying over one of the most densely populated regions in the Pacific Northwest for over an hour, Richard Russell had managed to crash in the one place where casualties would be limited to himself. But as the hours passed and more information emerged, as the radio recordings were released and analyzed and shared millions of times across the internet, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't a terrorist. This wasn't an ideologue or a political extremist or someone trying to make a statement about anything larger than his own internal struggles. This was Richard Russell, a 29-year-old man who worked on the ground crew, who loaded bags and guided planes, who by all accounts was friendly and helpful and seemed reasonably content with his life. Or so everyone had thought. His social media accounts were immediately scrutinized, dissected by journalists and amateur investigators alike, everyone searching for clues, for warning signs, for some explanation that would make sense of what had happened. What they found was deeply, almost painfully ordinary. Photos of Rich and his wife Hannah traveling, visiting national parks, smiling in front of landmarks. Posts about video games and aircraft and the simple pleasures of life. A blog he'd maintained sporadically, where he wrote about his experiences working at the airport, about his travels, about his dreams of seeing more of the world. One entry, written months before the incident, talked about visiting Iceland and Ireland, about wanting to experience different cultures, about feeling grateful for the flight benefits his job provided, even as he acknowledged the work itself was physically demanding and not particularly well compensated. "I lift a lot of bags," he'd written. "Like a lot of bags, so many bags." It was a small complaint, casual, the kind of thing anyone might write about their job. But in retrospect, with the terrible clarity that hindsight provides, people began to read more into it, began to construct narratives about wage stagnation and economic anxiety, about the crushing weight of modern existence, about how someone could be slowly suffocating under the demands of daily life while maintaining a cheerful exterior. His wife Hannah released a statement through family friends, asking for privacy as she tried to process what had happened, what her husband had done. "Those who knew Rich," the statement read, "knew he was a warm and compassionate man. It is impossible to encompass who he was in a press release. He was a faithful husband, a loving son, and a good friend. This is a complete shock to us." A complete shock. Those three words appeared again and again in statements from family, from friends, from co-workers at Horizon Air. No one had seen this coming. No one had noticed any warning signs, any indication that Rich was struggling to the point where he would steal an aircraft and crash it into an island. He'd shown up for work that day like any other day. He'd performed his duties. He'd been pleasant to those around him. And then, at some point during his shift, he'd made a decision that would end his life and transform him into an international news story, a cautionary tale, a symbol of something larger that people would spend years trying to articulate. The internet's reaction was complicated, fragmented, revealing in its contradictions. On one hand, there was the expected condemnation, the shock and horror at someone stealing a commercial aircraft, the justified concerns about airport security and how this had been allowed to happen. On the other hand, there was something else, something harder to define and uncomfortable to acknowledge. Sympathy, even admiration in some dark corners of the internet. People listened to those radio recordings, heard Rich's voice, that casual, self-deprecating humor, the way he apologized to everyone, the way he talked about being a broken guy with a few screws loose, and they recognized something in it. They heard their own frustrations, their own quiet desperation, their own fantasies of escape. He became a meme, which is the modern way of processing tragedy, of creating distance through irony, while simultaneously acknowledging emotional truth. Sky King, they called him, a nickname that spread across social media with startling speed, accompanied by images of the Q400 in flight, photoshopped to look heroic, mythical even. Songs were written about him, some sincere, some satirical. Artwork was created, theories were proposed. Some people saw him as a folk hero, a working-class everyman who'd decided to do something extraordinary, who'd rejected the grinding monotony of minimum wage labor for one moment of absolute freedom. Others saw him as deeply troubled, a suicide that happened to involve a stolen aircraft, a tragedy that should prompt conversations about mental health and economic inequality, and the isolation that can exist even in the midst of connection. Both perspectives contain truth, and both miss something essential. Because Richard Russell was not a symbol, he was a person, a specific individual with his own thoughts and feelings and motivations that we can only partially access through the fragments he left behind, the words he spoke in those final hours, the digital footprints that outlived him. To flatten him into a meme or a cautionary tale or a political statement is to do a disservice to the complexity of human experience, to the mystery of why people do what they do. The investigation that followed was thorough, comprehensive, involving the FBI, the National Transportation Safety Board, the FAA, and multiple other agencies. They reconstructed Rich's movements that day, tracked his path through the airport, interviewed everyone who'd seen him or spoken to him. They examined the wreckage, collected the black box, analyzed the flight data recorder to understand exactly what maneuvers he'd performed, how he'd managed to keep the aircraft aloft for as long as he did. They searched for evidence of planning, of premeditation, looking through his computer, his phone, his search history. What they found was ambiguous. There was evidence that Rich had been researching flight procedures, watching videos about aircraft operation, reading about the Q400 specifically. But this wasn't necessarily unusual for someone who worked around aircraft and had a genuine interest in aviation. There were no manifestos, no suicide notes, no clear indication that he'd been planning this for weeks or months. The prevailing theory became that it was something closer to an impulse, a decision made in the moment or perhaps earlier that same day, driven by factors that we can only speculate about. Depression was mentioned frequently in the analysis that followed, though Rich had never been diagnosed, had never sought treatment, had never given anyone reason to believe he was suffering to that degree. But depression doesn't always announce itself. It can hide behind smiles and humor and apparent functionality, wearing a person down from the inside while they maintain the facade that everything is fine. And when you listen to those recordings, when you hear Rich talk about being a broken guy, about having screws loose that he never really knew about until now, you hear someone who's perhaps achieving clarity about his own mental state, even as he's in the process of ending his life. The security implications of the incident were significant and immediate. How had a ground service agent been able to start and taxi a commercial aircraft without authorization? How had he been able to take off from a major international airport without being physically stopped? The answers revealed gaps in security protocols that had been considered adequate until they were so dramatically proven otherwise. Ground crew had access to aircraft as part of their normal job duties. They had the knowledge of how to operate ground equipment, which included understanding of basic aircraft systems. They were trusted employees, background checked and vetted, and the security measures in place were designed to prevent unauthorized people from accessing the tarmac, not to prevent authorized employees from doing unauthorized things with the equipment they had legitimate access to. In the wake of the incident, those protocols changed. Additional security measures were implemented, more restrictions on aircraft access, enhanced monitoring systems. The kind of reactive security theater that follows any high-profile breach. Measures that might prevent an exact repeat of this specific incident, but that fundamentally can't address the underlying problem, which is that security systems rely on trust, and trust is always vulnerable to betrayal. But perhaps the more important question, the one that's harder to answer with policy changes and enhanced protocols, is why? Why did Richard Russell do this? What was he feeling in those moments when he climbed into that cockpit, when he started those engines, when he pushed the throttles forward and felt the aircraft begin to move? We have his words captured on those radio recordings, and they give us glimpses. He talked about wanting to see what the aircraft could do. He talked about the beauty of the landscape, the mountains, and the water. He talked about not wanting to hurt anyone. He talked about being broken, about having screws loose. He talked about being a white guy making minimum wage, a comment that some interpreted as political and others saw as simply factual, an acknowledgement of economic reality. He talked about wanting to do a barrel roll, about hoping that would be it, about not being cut out for the military or for being a pilot. But words only tell us so much. They're filtered through the speaker's own understanding of their motivations, shaped by the moment, by who they're talking to, by 1,000 factors that complicate pure expression of truth. And so we're left with interpretations, with theories, with the stories we tell ourselves about why someone would do something so dramatic, so final, so completely outside the bounds of normal behavior. Some see it as a suicide, plain and simple, the method unusual, but the underlying motivation familiar to anyone who studied the terrible mathematics of self-destruction. Others see it as something more complicated, a kind of existential rebellion, a rejection of the circumstances of his life that took the form of one spectacular, impossible act of defiance. He took something he wasn't supposed to take. He did something he wasn't qualified to do. He flew, actually flew, when everything in the world said he couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. And for 75 minutes, he was free in a way that perhaps he'd never been free before, untethered from ground and expectation and the weight of ordinary existence. The barrel roll has become the most iconic moment of the entire incident, replayed endlessly, analyzed frame by frame. Aviation experts who reviewed the maneuver expressed genuine astonishment that he'd pulled it off, that the aircraft had held together under stresses it was never designed to handle. It was sloppy, yes. It was dangerous, absolutely. But it was also, in its own terrible way, beautiful. A 76-seat commercial aircraft, rolling inverted over Puget Sound at sunset, flown by someone who had no business being able to do it, who did it anyway, who shouted with genuine joy when he completed the maneuver. That moment encapsulates something essential about the entire incident, something that makes it more than just another tragedy, another news story that fades from memory after the news cycle moves on. It's the juxtaposition of the mundane and the extraordinary. The ground service agent who became a pilot, the ordinary guy who did something impossible, the broken person who, in breaking further, created something that people would remember. In the days and weeks after the crash, people visited Ketron Island, or tried to. Authorities kept the crash site secured, the investigation ongoing, but that didn't stop the curious, the mournful, the people who felt some connection to Richard Russell, even though they'd never met him. Makeshift memorials appeared where they could, notes and flowers and small tokens left by people who wanted to acknowledge what had happened, who wanted to mark the spot where a life had ended. Some of those notes were sympathetic, expressing understanding, even admiration. "Fly high, Sky King," some read. "You showed them what freedom looks like." Others were more somber, more focused on the tragedy of it, on the waste of a life, on the pain his death must have caused his family and friends. "Rest in peace," they said. "You deserved better." The reaction revealed something about the culture that consumed the story, about the way people saw themselves in Richard Russell's final flight. We live in an age of quiet desperation disguised as productivity, where millions of people work jobs that don't pay enough to afford the life they were promised, where mental health struggles are stigmatized even as they become increasingly common, where the gap between what people are told they should be able to achieve and what they actually can achieve grows wider every year. Richard Russell, in his final act, seemed to give voice to some of that frustration, that sense of being trapped, of going through the motions while something inside slowly dies. But it's important, crucial even, to remember that whatever Richard Russell's motivations were, whatever pain he was experiencing, his choice solved nothing. It ended his suffering by ending his life, but it created new suffering for everyone who loved him, everyone who knew him, everyone who had to process the reality of what he'd done. His wife lost her husband. His parents lost their son. His friends lost someone they cared about. The controllers who spent that hour trying to talk him down, trying to find a way to end this without death, they have to live with the recordings of those conversations, with the knowledge that despite their best efforts, they couldn't save him. Suicide, no matter how spectacular the method, is not rebellion. It's not freedom. It's the permanent elimination of the possibility of things getting better, of finding meaning, of discovering that the darkness that seems absolute and infinite is actually temporary and survivable. And while we can acknowledge the pain that drove Richard Russell to do what he did, while we can try to understand the desperation that must have consumed him, we can't romanticize it. We can't turn him into a hero without also acknowledging that heroism would have been choosing to live, choosing to get help, choosing to find another way through the darkness. The official investigation concluded that Richard Russell's actions were suicidal and that he had operated the aircraft in a manner consistent with someone who did not intend to survive. They found no evidence of mental health treatment, no history of suicidal ideation, no clear precipitating event that would explain why he chose that particular day, that particular method. In the absence of answers, They offered the facts. What happened, how it happened, the timeline, and the mechanics of it. But facts don't explain why. They can't tell us what Richard Russell was thinking when he made his decision, what he was hoping to achieve or escape. What we're left with is the story. The narrative that we've constructed from the fragments, from the radio recordings, and the witness statements, and the social media posts, and the wreckage. And that story, like all stories about real people and real tragedy, is incomplete. It has gaps and contradictions and mysteries that will never be fully resolved. But it's also, in its incompleteness, deeply human. Because people are complicated, we contain multitudes. We can be functional and broken at the same time. We can be kind to others while being cruel to ourselves. We can go through our days appearing fine while slowly drowning inside. Richard Russell's final flight lasted 75 minutes. In that time, he flew over some of the most beautiful landscape in North America. He executed maneuvers that professional pilots trained for years to perform. He spoke to air traffic controllers with courtesy and humor and heartbreaking honesty. He apologized to everyone he thought he might be disappointing. And then he crashed into Ketron Island, and his story ended. But the questions his story raised didn't end. They continue to echo, continue to resonate, continue to make us uncomfortable because they don't have easy answers. What do we owe to people who are suffering in ways we can't see? How do we create systems that value human dignity over productivity? How do we recognize the warning signs when someone is struggling, when they've become expert at hiding it? How do we talk about mental health in ways that reduce stigma and encourage people to seek help before they reach the point where death seems like the only option? These are not questions with simple solutions. They require systemic change, cultural shift, individual courage. They require us to look honestly at the world we've created, at the economic and social pressures we've normalized, at the ways we've collectively decided that some lives matter more than others based on their productivity or their status or their ability to afford healthcare. Richard Russell was a ground service agent at Sea-Tac International Airport. He made minimum wage loading bags onto planes that other people would fly to destinations he could only visit on his limited days off. He was married to someone who loved him. He had friends and family who cared about him. He had hobbies and interests and dreams. He was, by every external measure, an ordinary person living an ordinary life. And on August 10th, 2018, for 75 minutes, he became something else. Something extraordinary and tragic and impossible to neatly categorize. The sky he flew through that evening is the same sky that's always there, vast and indifferent and beautiful. The water of Puget Sound continues to flow around the islands, tides rising and falling with mechanical precision. The airport continues to operate, planes taking off and landing, bags being loaded by people who do the invisible work that makes modern life possible. Everything continues, except for Richard Russell, who made a choice that ended all his possibilities, all his tomorrows, all his chances at finding another way. We remember him now, when we remember him at all, as Sky King. a nickname that grants him a kind of immortality that transforms his suicide into myth. But myths are dangerous things. They smooth out the rough edges, eliminate the contradictions, make heroic what was actually just desperately, terribly sad. Richard Russell deserves to be remembered, not as a meme or a symbol or a cautionary tale, but as a person who struggled, a person who hurt, a person who, in his final moments, chose the sky over the ground, chose motion over stasis, chose one spectacular act of defiance over a lifetime of quiet desperation. And a person who, in making that choice, left behind people who loved him and who will spend the rest of their lives trying to understand why. The answer to that why, if it exists at all, died with him in the forests of Ketron Island. What we have instead are the fragments, the recordings, the memories, the wreckage, and the enduring mystery of what drives a person to do something so extreme, so final, so beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior. On August 10th, 2018, a ground service agent named Richard Russell stole a Q400 turboprop from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and flew it for 75 minutes before crashing into an island in Puget Sound. These are the facts. Everything else is interpretation, speculation, the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the senseless. And perhaps that's all we ever really have when tragedy strikes. The facts and the stories and the uncomfortable questions that linger long after the headlines fade. Rest in peace, Richard Russell. May those who struggle as you struggled find the help they need before the darkness becomes absolute. And may we all remember that behind every spectacular tragedy is a person, complicated and flawed and human, who deserved better than the ending they chose.